This is the next in the Patriot Minute series. I'm Grandpa Rick. The Angel in the White House. How a Godly Woman Saved America in Its Darkest Hour. President Abraham Lincoln came to the White House not a particularly religious man. He was quick-witted. Yes, he was tall and strong. He didn't need to rely on God for his good fortune, or at least not in his own mind, as he was thinking at the time. One rocky year, however, into the Civil War, and he began to realize that our nation was dying. He needed help. Everyone around him thought they could do better, and that Lincoln was on the wrong side of history. It sounds familiar today. His abolitionist desires to kill slavery and to preserve the Union, many thought would be impossible. The whims of a naive frontier dreamer, in fact. Many believed that the slaves were not worth the incredibly high cost of freeing them, or the Union saving. Lincoln found himself increasingly isolated and alone. Then, personal disaster struck. Lincoln's little boy, Willie, contracted typhoid fever. Within a short time, while suffering terribly, he died. Lincoln was devastated, of course. In 1862, the darkest year of the Civil War up to that point, there were thousands of young American men, mostly young, died with each battle. People were losing. They were losing hope with every pain-filled passing day. Friends said that the tall, normally good-humored and capable Lincoln seemed lost without his son and his best friend, little Willie. The little boy was with Lincoln all the time, it seemed. Colleagues began to speculate, some hoping, in fact, for the day that he would collapse with grief and exhaustion. Then one day, an Army nurse, her name Rebecca Pomeroy, arrived in the White House. Remarkably, she was remarkably cheerful, and she was a genuine positive force for good within the Lincoln family, with a naturally skilled nursing hand. So Lincoln pulled Rebecca aside one day and asked her why she was always such a ray of sunshine, why everything she touched seemed to get better and was healed. She said, "Mr. President, let me tell you why. Because I met God." She told of her tragic past, the premature death of her husband. Then her mother, son, and daughter died. After these devastating tragedies, she had struggled with hopeless depression. Then one day she visited a church service and had decided to say a prayer. And she had a life-changing spiritual witness that day, one that she said she could not deny. She offered President Lincoln her humble testimony of Christ, which touched the president in ways that he had not experienced before. She added that with all the suffering of the war, there was simply too much to do to allow herself the luxury of being depressed. I'm sure those words impacted the president greatly. Rebecca, after what she'd been through, Rebecca Pomeroy then offered the president specific biblical verses to read and to ponder. Along with Mrs. Lincoln, with Mary Lincoln, the president studied the scriptures with Rebecca. They talked about the Christian faith and how it might help the president in his calling, and he continued to view that as such, to save our nation. And Mrs. Pomeroy promised the president that the Lord would soothe his tortured soul over the loss of his precious son. During this, his greatest trial, President Lincoln began to gain a testimony of Jesus. He experienced the power of prayer and felt the pure love of Christ. He pondered the eternal sacrifice of the Savior's atonement and what it really meant. And though continually haunted by Willie's passing and the massive loss of life in the ongoing war, of which Lincoln began to blame himself, he finally returned spiritually renewed to the critical duties of America's wartime president. The Lincolns were often seen traveling together with Rebecca Pomeroy, visiting the military hospitals to minister to the wounded soldiers. Rebecca was, in fact, such a healing force and such a positive Christian influence that many credited her with helping save the nation during that critical spring and summer of 1862. She helped the president to understand that for a nation to survive, it must be a moral nation, a nation that did not harbor or tolerate the enslavement and abuse of God's children. She taught him that America needed to be on the right side of God. So that summer, Lincoln began working on the Emancipation Proclamation. With the Union victory that came in September at the Battle of Antietam, he issued the proclamation to the nation, and the rest, as they say, is history. And while slavery was legal, even common in much of the world at that time, Lincoln understood that the Lord was angry with the United States, both North and South, because such a hellish institution still existed in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Such was blatant hypocrisy, and God the Father, just like his only begotten Son, we know from Scriptures, seems to disdain the hypocrite most of all. But more to the point, such an evil will eliminate if the United States was to endure as a free, strong, and prosperous nation. And that a righteous and free United States would in fact one day be called upon to rescue the world from evil tyrannies. Lincoln wrote, quote, "Our defense is in the preservation of the spirit which prizes liberty as the heritage of all men in all lands everywhere. Destroy this spirit, and you have planted the seeds of despotism around your own doors, unquote. I believe that Lincoln was instructed by the Spirit that the curse of slavery was rotting the American soul from within. And unless he, as president, could finally cut it from every inch of the American homeland, God would continue and rightfully punish us. This brutal civil war, over 650,000, mostly young Americans, were killed in this war. This war, I believe, was designed by God to humble America and eliminate this satanic evil once and for all. A United States that would be free for all men, united as a nation that lives up to its spiritual privileges, would in fact be a nation blessed by God, and the angels cannot be restrained from being our associates. Please remember, my friends, America is not just any land. It is a covenant land with a promise directly from God, as contained in sacred writ. What an incredible blessing. American exceptionalism? You bet. But only if we are worthy. I pray that we strive to live up to our spiritual privileges more important now than ever. I appreciate your time. I'm Grandpa Rick.